I think it's time to start. But what a delight to see you all here today. And most warmly welcome to the Swedish Collegium and to the 6th Wittrock Lecture. The Wittrock Lecture series is arranged annually by us at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Study. And at these lectures, internationally renowned and state-of-the-art scholars give a public lecture based on their research interests. And the topics may range across the humanities and social sciences and cover a broad spectrum of issues related to global history and modernity, globalization processes and social change, intellectual history, and the plurality of knowledge cultures. And the lecture series also aims to address complex challenges facing contemporary society, from the shifting nature of globalization, crisis in democracy, to the future of governance and indeed human civilization. And the Wittrock Lecture Series was launched in 2019 in honor of the contributions of Professor Björn Wittrock. Wonderful to see you here. And as principal of SCAS, or in the years 1996 to 2018, and really its driving force ever since its creation in 1985, Björn Wittrock has contributed significantly to the strong position of the Institute as an internationally renowned institute for advanced study, and to the social sciences and the humanities at large in Sweden, Europe, and beyond. And through your research, Björn, you have also contributed to the advancement of the sociology of ancient, medieval, and modern societies, to global history, intellectual history, and civilizational analysis, and continue to do so. Our global civilization today is one fraught with tensions, tribalism, and divisions. There are many influences pushing us in the direction of friction. All the more important then is to stop and reflect sociologically, anthropologically, and indeed across disciplines about what it is that pushes us in this direction and how we could possibly redirect our minds and actions to a more beneficial and constructive way forward. Our distinguished guest, Michèle Lamont, asks in her book, Seeing Others, how we can erode the lines of division and create more opportunities for understanding between classes, ethnic groups, racial groups, gender, and other lines of division. In the current context of political polarization, she says, we urgently need to acknowledge the power of recognition, to build bridges between us and to erode boundaries. We need to urgently lift up what she calls ordinary universalism, what we have in common as people and what makes us similar or compatible. And this is also the topic of today's lecture. And it's also a lucky coincidence that it is also the International Women's Day today. I'm happy and honored to present today's speaker, Michèle Lamont, a leader in the study of culture and inequality in the United States and well beyond, helping to redefine the field of sociology as we know it today. Michèle Lamont is professor of sociology and of African and African American studies and the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies at Harvard University. A cultural sociologist who studies boundaries and inequality, she has tackled topics such as dignity, respect, stigma, racism, class, and racial boundaries, and how we evaluate social worth across societies. Her studies in these areas have been published in a number of books and articles, most recently, I believe, in the book I just mentioned, Seeing Others, How Recognition Works, and How It Can Heal a Divided World, published in 2023. Among her other publications, her book, How Professors Think, Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment, published in 2009, this book came very close to our own everyday world as academics, since it offered a nuanced and perceptive account of how recognition works in the academic judgment and of the alleged tension between values of academic excellence and diversity. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you, Michelle.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm extremely honored to be here today. This is such a venerable place with a great history. I did my graduate work in France, and I remember walking on Linnaeus Street near Paris 7, Jussieu. So it became this, the reality of Linnaeus became even more real to me when I visited Uppsala a few years ago. So it's really wonderful to be here, and to be here in the context of the Wittrock Lecture. We share an appreciation in the history and the sociology of the social sciences. So it's really a great honor to be here. So thank you everyone for being here. And yes, this book has strangely become even more timely over the last, well, it came out in September, and I've been giving a number of talks about it. And as the, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, and as the, we are in a context where I think recognition is becoming even more central to all the political dynamics that we see in Europe, in North America. So here you have the cover of the book. The white one is the American version. The American and the British publishers, Penguin and Simon & Schuster, could not agree not only on the title, but they couldn't agree on the cover either. My favorite title is the British title, How to Redefine Worth. But my favorite cover is the American title, because I think the design captures perfectly what the book is about, which is really to broaden the circle of people who belong, who feel that that they are worthy in our society. And here you have the circle of belonging with groups that are of different size and different colors and more or less further from the center. So the puzzle of this project was very much about how to broaden inclusion. And why did I write this book? Well, we've gone through a few years of intense social movements that are all making recognition claims. You have groups here. You have the farmers, right, in Brussels, who have been in the news in the last few years. The recognition gap between urban and urban population across Europe is just extremely broad. And the farmers are very upset that so much resources are being put toward promoting electric cars at the time when, at least in the United States, only 5% of the population have them, and the rest of the population doesn't want them because they cannot afford them. So in other contexts, of course in the US, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had the Me Too movement. These movements of recognition happen not only on the progressive and the liberal side of the political spectrum, but of course we have also the MAGA, Make American Great Again, which is mostly led by downwardly mobile working class men who feel that their status is being diminished by the growing presence of immigrants in the country, and they are promoting or making more salient their American identity as a high status identity that they have. Therefore, the embrace of nationalism. And of course, this is happening not only in the US, but across Europe. I also decided to write this book during the Trump era, and like other my compatriots, I felt somewhat depressed. So as a good social scientist, I turned to the social science literature to figure out, what do you do when you're depressed? And I figured out, well, it's very important to cultivate other forms of hope. And when you read the literature on hope, you learn that narratives play a crucial role. You have to be exposed to alternative narratives through which you can define the future and redefine your agency, your capacity to be agentic as you project yourself into the future. So that will help you understand why I decided to write the book that I wrote, which is really to turn to people whose job it is to produce new narratives, to figure out how to broaden the circle of who belongs and who matters in our society. So I did conduct interviews with a large number of professional change agents, whom I'm going to define in a second, as well as ordinary people, as they aim to address this recognition gap. And I will focus only on the liberal and progressive end of the political spectrum, because I cannot do everything. And there's plenty of books written on the right side of the political spectrum. So these two T-shirts here are in some ways symbolic of what this talk is about. The white T-shirt is worn by someone named Zachary Drucker, who's a trans person. And they were an advisor to the show Transparent, which was widely watched in the US. And Transparent tells the story of a woman, advanced middle age, who late in life is trans. She becomes a woman, and she has to negotiate her new identity with her adult children. And I interviewed Joy Soloway, who is the person who created that show. And when I interviewed them about the reason and what they tried to achieve by creating this show, they said, I'm trying to make trans people less abhorrent, more understandable for people who've had very little contact with trans people, and also to humanize them as we see this woman negotiate her relationship with her children, something that most human beings who have children have to learn to do. So really the question of creating bonds, making it possible for people to relate by witnessing how her life unfolds. And the T-shirt I see you, those of us who have Gen Zs, children between the age of 18 and 30, this is, the question of being seen is extremely important, because they want to live authentically in line with how they self-define. And this has become extremely important to them, as is the promotion of a society that's more inclusive. And I will tie this to the decline of the American dream in a second. The black T-shirt became very important in the American context. I presume you've had something equivalent in European societies as a celebration of what I call ordinary universalism. Love is a slogan that was used in the context of the same-sex marriage campaign to say, love who you want. But you have other statements here as no human is illegal. So it's really a celebration of essentially what we all share as human beings, independently of ideology, independently of the Enlightenment, independently of human rights, anything that would be coded as a historic narrative that is tied to specific moments of history or specific political regime. So that's really what I'm going to talk about as I think about how to make boundaries between groups more fluid. So one question that the project asks is really, what are the models that we face as individuals, as we are, living? I'm a cultural sociologist, so I'm interested in the cultural messaging that surrounds us as we, go through our lives, and how we draw on various toolkits to make sense of our life and to assess groups of people around us, to give them a valence as more or less valuable. So to understand this better, I turn to what could be called the cultural supply side. This is what I just said, the narratives we're exposed to have the potential of giving us hope. And here you have the poster of Black Panther, and the reason it is here is because one of the people I interviewed for this book is Channing Dunghay, who at the time was in charge of global programming at Netflix. She was vice president for global programmation, which is a job that just blows my mind. And she's the one who decided to diffuse Black Panther in African countries and in India to enormous popularity. So that's an example with the story of Black Panther is a utopian story that tells us about, a fictive civilization where Black people are the heroes, and this power of providing a positive representation of group identity is being viewed as extremely revolutionary, and a lot of the people I interviewed are engaged in this kind of cultural production. So the goal here is also to discuss the conditions for social resilience, which we could define in contrast to grit. So I'm sure that all the social scientists in the room are familiar with the work of Angela Duckworth, who has popularized this concept of grit, which is framed as an individual, basically personality traits that helps us understand why some people are able to pull themselves by their bootstrap as they encounter challenges. And the mystery is, why are some people better able than others to do this? Instead of this focus on the individual, my colleague and I have published this book, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era. It came out of a research project or research interdisciplinary research team that I co-directed with the political scientist Peter Hall, which was supported by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and the CFAR asked us to work on successful societies. They gave us this name, and we didn't like the name. At first, we felt like this is way too normative, but the group started, as we started our discussion, we realized we're all deeply concerned with the question of successful societies, whether or not we want to define it as such. And you can define, societal success by low suicide rate, a high level of intermarriage across ethno-racial group. There's a whole slew of indicators that we could use, but we were mostly interested in how we can structure our environment differently to enable more people to become all they can be, in a kind of vaguely Amaterasen framework of capabilities, but focused not on individual, but on the group capability. And we were primarily concerned, Peter Hall and others in the group being neo-institutionalist, the role of institutions in doing this. And I'm a cultural sociologist, so I was concerned with how can we structure our environment with repertoires that enable people to do things they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So an example of this would be same-sex marriage laws, which of course are laws, so they give access to LGBTQ people the power to get married, to have access to one of the most sacred laws or institutions in our society, marriage, but it also diffuses these laws, diffused to populations that had been historically stigmatized, the view that they are deserving of this legitimacy that law gives. And as these laws were passed, there was a correlation with the decline in number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ high school students. So this question of the impact of destigmatization on mental health is very much at the center of the inquiry. But the argument is also very much a structural argument, understood not as a social structural argument, but one that is focused on cultural structures. How can we create an environment that really enables a broadening of group boundaries, essentially? So the case study, the book is a case study on the production and the diffusion of societal ideals, and we draw on two types of interviews with these change agents whose occupation brings them to create new narratives. So it ranges from the entertainment industry, so we have 75 interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives, people who create shows such as Joyce Holloway, but also in the sector of advocacy, social movements, policy, inclusive capitalism, all kinds of people who are concerned with the creation of new narratives. And then we also turn to interviews with young people because they're defining the future, they're gonna live it too. So we have 80 interviews with college students that were conducted in the fall of 2019 and also in the summer of 2020 during the pandemic. They study in 32 different colleges and universities in the Midwest and the Northeast. And the interviews with change agents were also conducted during the pandemic, which means that we were able to get access to an unbelievable group of people who would never have been able to talk to otherwise because everyone was at home and eager to talk to people. So the key concept here is the concept of recognition, which has been explored. It comes from Hegel, but among philosophers, there's been a large literature focused on this concept. Axel Honneth, the German philosopher, is probably one of the most prominent names associated with this concept, and we can define recognition as a social act by which the positive social worth of individuals and groups is affirmed and acknowledged by others. So what's crucial here is that it's a social process and an interactive process You can, give yourself recognition all you want, but it's much better if it is confirmed by others. So it's an interactive, interactional process. We view ourselves as worthy because people around us define ourselves as worthy. Other people, he engaged in a very famous debate with the other philosopher, Nancy Fraser, about the politics of distribution and recognition. I can talk about this in the Q&A if you want. The counterpoint to this concept of recognition is stigmatization. Famous sociologist who developed this line of work is Irving Goffman. Here it is the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. And those two concepts, recognition and stigmatization, really work hand in hand as we define our identity. So social identity is a result of an intersection between social identification, who I define myself, and group recognition, how others define me. And that's who I am, what's my identity results from these two processes that are ongoing as we lead our lives. And the outcome is definitions of cultural membership, which is about who how social actors understand themselves as similar or different from others. And it comes with an understanding of social obligation entailed in these relationships. So who we feel responsible toward, who do we feel like, deserving of social welfare support, for instance. So that's the concept I'm going to give you for today. It's enough. But the broader the context of the book is also one where I'm not denying in any way the importance of material resources. The social sciences are based on very materialist assumption, although of course Weberian sociology is more causal. But the point here is just to say that in general, we have really underestimated the importance of recognition in the social sciences, although a growing literature tells us how crucially important it is for subjective well-being. So this is demonstrated, for instance, by the large literature on the impact of perceived racism on subjective well-being. So epidemiologists write about the allostatic load, i.e. the wear and tear of everyday life that gets under the skin as we're exposed to poverty and racism, and that results in the major health disparities between racial groups in the US, for instance. We also see this dominance of materialism in how we think about the relationship between material resources and poverty and well-being. So it's not always that materialism determines well-being. For instance, think about parents who have children who are queer, and the parents don't accept how those children self-define. They kick them out of the house, and these kids become poor, homeless. So that's a case where stigmatization drives poverty. So the book is also an invitation to rethink this causal link between poverty and well-being, and to complexify it and to view it more multidimensional. And I will see again how politics is also very much shaped by recognition. So I want to recommend this new book, The Science of Dignity, by Hitlin and Anderson, which offers a really comprehensive overview of all we know. And the basic point is, dignity is absolutely essential to human flourishing, and it's as important as material resources, and that's what their book demonstrates. And how I came to this book is in part from having written different books on the topic of dignity and respect. So in 2000, I wrote a book comparing the French and the American upper middle class titled The Dignity of the Working Man, where I compare black and white workers in New York and white and North African workers in France, to show that in both cases, these workers define their self-worth by their ability to lead respectable lives, to pay their bills, to be hard workers. So their value is very much defined by their being hardworking and responsible. At the same time as they draw these moral boundaries around themselves, they say the kind of people I don't like are the people who are sponges, who don't do this, the poor, low-income people, and people of color who are sponging off the system. So really demonstrating the articulation between moral, racial, and class boundaries. And to this day, it's very difficult. Many people don't realize at what point interaction between these moral, class, and racial boundaries are deeply at the center of anti-immigrant movements in both countries, for instance, since immigrants are perceived as low income. And the Getting Respect book, which came out in 2016, was about how African American Black Brazilians in 3 groups in Israel, including Ethiopian Jews, Black people in the 3 countries, perceive racism very differently and react to it very differently. With, in the US, a perception that you have no choice, you have to confront racism. And that's made possible by the civil rights movement and many other factors. And they have very little doubt about when something racist is happening, whereas in Brazil, incidents are constantly read as having to do with the fact that people think they're perceived as being poor, not because they're perceived as being Black, since the respondents say, yeah, we all have a little bit of a Black grandmother somewhere. So the racial boundaries are drawn very differently. So this is just to give you a little bit of a background on the scholarship on which the book builds. And it builds on a number of sociological papers that I wrote for my colleagues. But the book itself is very much a trade book. It's my first trade book, and I decided to read it precisely because of the Trump presidency. And I had colleagues, you may have heard about the book by Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, How Democracy Dies, which was very important during the first Trump presidency, not the only Trump presidency, I shouldn't say the first. And it really helped people understand how democracy was weakened, was in the process of being weakened. And I feel that although we all hear a lot about inclusion and DEI and wokeism, a topic that we're going to talk about in the panel this afternoon, I feel like most people don't have the conceptual tools to make sense of recognition and why it's important and what we can do to promote it. So that's the context in which this book emerged. And I have here, I'm building here a little bit. This is not part of the talk that I typically give on this book, but since here we are a community that includes a lot of social scientists, I thought I'd say a few words on the approach, the contribution to inequality that the project does. So a lot of sociologists who have worked on the intersection on the causes of inequality have focused either on cognition, so stereotypes, for instance, stereotyping or implicit associations, and the macro social patterns, think about, for instance, racial segregation. And what I'm really concerned with in this book is where the question mark is, how do we connect the intracranial? The intracranial is not studied by sociologists, or if they tried, I don't think we do it very well because we're not equipped to study motivation. But we are equipped to study macro demographic patterns. But what happens, the mediation between the micro and the macro, we're still very much in the process of studying this. And among the models for understanding the causes of inequality that we have developed, the most classical studies are the type 1 studies, focused on domination and exploitation in Marx or Weber, for instance, Closure and Parkins, opportunity hoarding. The main books on inequality that we're reading in sociology, Charles Tilly, for instance, are concerned with type 1 process. Here I'm not even talking about economists. I could broaden this figure by adding Piketty and the focus on wealth, etc. The type 2 is really what Bourdieu gave us with the focus on cultural and symbolic and economic capital and social capital. But what I'm adding is really the type 3, which is all these processes that are ongoing, that are cultural processes that have not been fully theorized yet. So that's what I try to do in a paper titled, What is Missing? Cultural Processes in the Making of Inequality, which is very much complementary to this trade book. So what we end up at the end is understanding the various pathways through which inequality is produced. That comes from a number of different processes that are interacting with each other, and some of them simply have not been analyzed as much as others. So the literature and ecological effect, my former colleague, William Julius Wilson, is extremely famous for developing an analysis of neighborhood effects and the concentration of poverty in neighborhoods. But other aspects really remain neglected. So that's how I locate myself. But that's just for us social scientists among ourselves. Now I'm zooming back up to the more general argument of the book. So the context in which my analysis takes place is one that many people have described as a polycrisis after several decades of growing inequality that economists have amply documented. And this is coupled with, of course, the COVID crisis, the growing political polarization, what many political scientists call affective polarization, the fact that people on the left and the right simply dislike each other and don't want to socialize with each other. And you have the movement, the global movement for social justice of 2020. So it's not only an American story. The rise of the right, which comes with, whereas since 45, many groups have gained many rights. This is clearly documented. We've seen over the last few years some of these rights being taken away for trans people, for instance. So we have the typical reaction, counter-reaction dynamic that sociologists of social movements described. But we also have a moment of hopelessness. Last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a big spread in the New York Times about this epidemic of mental health crises that Americans are facing. I don't know if there's a parallel development in Europe. I'm very curious about this. But in this context of growing inequality, many people experience hopelessness, which has fed this mental health crisis. For the purpose of this book, particularly important in the neoliberal term is the neoliberal scripts of self that have surrounded us to the point where they're now totally taken for granted. And that's about how most of us are led to define what constitutes a worthy life. And this worthy life is often defined by a focus on self-reliance, the idea that we should engage in the pursuit of success, defined as socioeconomic success. So it's the American dream on steroids. People think that they need to absolutely gain a college degree and become professionals and managers. So you have a college divide, a very important boundary separating people in this room, college-educated professionals and managers, for those who don't have that, to the point where this boundary becomes so widely taken for granted that it becomes invisible, and those who don't have it feel really that they are considered not worthy. And this orientation of the college-educated professionals and managers is associated with kind of social Darwinism and competitiveness. And we are feeding these notions to our children as we tell them what kind of life they're supposed to live. That became even more accentuated with the 2007 recession, where at least in the American context, many parents became helicopter parents. Producing excellent sheeps, engaging in opportunity hoarding, doing all kinds of things to make sure that their children would not be downwardly mobile. And that comes hand in hand with the cultivation of meritocracy. And of course, many people think meritocracy is a wonderful thing because it allows people to be upwardly mobile if they are willing to work hard and demonstrate perseverance and persistence. But at the same time, the celebration of meritocracy often ignores the fact that we are not working on an even playing field. My children have two parents who are college educated, and we live in one of the suburbs of Boston, which has absolutely excellent school. 10 minutes from where I live, across the Muddy River, you have one of the worst neighborhoods in terms of public schools in Boston. And this is, great physical proximity, but worlds apart. So the cult of meritocracy, by celebrating it, ignores the fact that, in fact, the educational system is as much a tool for mobility as it is a tool for injustice. And as we are celebrating the neoliberal scripts of self, people often ignore that. So we know that this celebration, and one way that we can measure the hegemony of this neoliberal scripts of self is to look at the growing popularity of meritocracy across advanced industrial societies over the 20th century. And this is what Jonathan Maisch, who teaches at Boston University, has done by comparing survey data across a large number of 23 advanced industrial societies. And he found that belief in meritocracy increased everywhere, except for 5 countries. So you can see here it's the highest of all in the most neoliberal societies, United Kingdom and the US. There's only 5 countries where it does not increase over the period of 1930 to 2010. That includes Austria, Canada, and France. I could discuss why a little bit later. Don't know exactly what happens in Sweden. If I can see here. I don't have my glasses, so maybe what happened? Is it flat? It increases, yeah. And you all know that Sweden became increasingly neoliberal over the last decades, right? So, yes, so the story is not at all only an American story. We have an American dream, but of course the Chinese have the Chinese dream, and there are various modes of celebration of upward mobility in Europe as well. So in the American context, many Americans still believe in the American dream, but the dream is full of cracks. When you look at survey data, people say, I can achieve the American dream, but most people can't. My children will not live the American dream the way I did. So that's a very big divide between the boomers and the Gen X and the millennials and the Gen Zs. And it has become so vaguely defined, like having a good family, that at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything. And it's a dream that is constantly reenacted and kept alive because of the dream of all the immigrants who want to come to the United States. And the non-college educated embrace it too, because to say I don't want the American dream is kind of viewed as demonstrating a lack of cultural citizenship, saying I don't want to be part of this country. So, and at the same time, as I said earlier, the American dream maintains a very rigid boundary between the college-educated professionals and managers and the working class, who feel very much, and also the groups that are associated with low-income people in the working class, for instance, immigrants. Yet at the same time, this is the paradox, the professionals and managers are constantly offered to the rest of the population as a model that everyone else should emulate. And that is clear from a content analysis of primetime American television domestic situation comedies, where the vast majority of the characters are professionals and managers. I don't know if shows such as White Lotus, you know, all the Wives of Beverly Hills shows, I mean, this celebration of wealth and of a lifestyle that is kind of totally out of reach for the majority. And when you have working class characters, think of Bart Simpson, the individuals are typically bumbling idiots, you know, not anyone that you would like to emulate. So if you are working class, you never see many representation of yourself that are glorifying or dignified. So this, you know, I think the wear and tear that comes with this constant bombardment of celebration of people like us becomes totally taken for granted and has contributed to, you know, books such as Anne Case and Angus Deaton, Death by Despair, about the opioid epidemic, the growing number of suicide in the American context, in the more working class. And I have a recent paper co-authored with 2 colleagues who work at Eurofound, which is the survey group in charge of studying quality of life in the EU, which shows also a growing divide between rural and urban population in Europe. So again, it's not only an American story. So this is a bleak picture. I could talk to you also about the crisis in mental health, which is, one would expect it to be profound at the bottom of the social structure, but it's also quite acute at the top, since the upper middle class is so anxious about downward mobility. And we know from many surveys that upper middle class people often feel very anxious about the future and also overwhelmed because they work too hard and they don't have enough time to relax. And the solutions that are offered to them are typically individualist solutions, yoga, meditation, self-care. But this gets you only so far, right? I love those things, but you know, they're not going to solve our problems. So the book is very much oriented toward offering less individualist solution. And I think there's, the UCLA conducts every year a survey of first-year undergrads, and there's such a steep increase in the number of students who feel that they are experiencing deep mental health crisis in the form of anxiety and depression, and they feel that they don't matter. So for those of us who have children in this age group, I don't know if it applies as much in Sweden. I know that there's a lot of mental health issues here as well. So I'm a mother of 3 Gen Zs too, so the sense of urgency in writing this book was also in part motivated by the desire to give my kids hope and to say, where are we going to find hope for that generation? I think we have no choice. The book is very hopeful. I think the alternative is just to not be hopeful, which I don't think leads us anywhere. So the solution for me is to look at the transformation of narratives. And I ask, as a cultural sociologist, where are the cultural narratives being produced? What do they tell us? And if they produce hope, how do they do it? And the argument is that they emerge from different sources. I look at the move from a unidimensional definition of worth, the neoliberal definition of the self, of the ideal self, to a more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy. So that we move from defining excellent people not only as producers, but also as carers, for instance, or as spiritual leaders, or as creators, community builders. So that's one approach. The second one has to do with ordinary universalism, defining who's worthy as things that any human beings can achieve independently of socioeconomic status. And that's something that was very salient in my book, The Dignity of Working Man, the basic notion of treat people like people. You know, treat people decently. That's what we owe each other. And then the process of stigma reduction. It has happened before. It will happen again. I will talk in a second about how HIV/AIDS went from being deeply stigmatized in 1980 to being basically not stigmatized today. This happened for that group, but it didn't happen for people who are obese. Why? So I turn to how do we study empirically the public sphere then? So the traditional model is given to us by Habermas. You know, the ideal type was that, you know, bourgeois men getting together in cafes in Vienna discussing the affairs of the day. And of course, this is not at all how the public sphere is working today. So we have to think about the public sphere as much more complex, involving the social media, involving professionalized social movements and advocacy and philanthropies. So I draw on the 2 papers that are cited here that have tried to update how we understand the public sphere. And I came up with this kind of organizational field analysis. Where is it coming from? Different organizational fields ranging from cultural production to philanthropy to social media. And then through the pandemic, I mobilized all kinds of networks to identify people from these various fields who would be willing to talk to us. So I just have a couple of slides to whet your appetite in case you're interested in getting the book and you want to see the full list, which I'm kind of proud of. So it includes people like Heather Boucher, who is now part of Biden's Council of Academic Advisors, to Leah Greenberg and Zeb Ezra Levin, who created Indivisible, which was the Democratic Party's response to the Tea Party to really mobilize the population from the bottom up. Rashard Robinson, who really has been promoting voting among African Americans, and a few people from Hollywood. So Mike Schur, who created Park and Recreation and The Good Life. I don't know if those shows mean anything to you. The Queer Eye, these are all very popular. The person who was the producer for The Handmaid's Tale. We had all the graduate students were really interested in taking that job as research assistant, as you would imagine. It was really, really cool. And Jack Conte, who created Patreon, which has allowed a lot of musicians and cultural producers to make a living independently of radio station. So anyway, I'm going to move on. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of what these cultural producers do. One is more niche and the other one is more mainstream. So to start with the niche one, this is a photograph by Lyle Ashton Harris. I interviewed several artists who are representing queer and Black people. And when I interviewed Lyle about this painting and what he was aiming to do with it, not this painting, this photography, he said that he used those words, and those words are used by many other respondents. First, he tried to make them visible, a group that is typically invisible. And then he tried to move beyond the stereotypes to give a 3-dimensional depiction of the group, a representation that they would recognize themselves in, and that represented them with dignity. and confirm to them how they want to be perceived. So it's really a question of affirming the dignity and the respect that the groups believe they deserve. And you can see the quest for to be viewed as dignity in the way that the person with the blue sports coat holds his body. Another more mainstream example, if you Google on YouTube question bridge, you will see a video that was produced by Hank Willis Thomas, for which he interviewed 150 African American men living across the country, and he asked them the simple question, what does it mean for you to be a black man today? And what he found in the American context, and he found that there was a very wide range of responses, and that the only thing all these men had in common was the experience of microaggression and discrimination and being underestimated or invisible. So stigmatization is about being invisible, underestimated, not perceived the way you would want to be perceived. What's remarkable about this project is that he was able to create an alliance with an important philanthropy called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which is very well known for having led My Brother's Keepers campaign during the Obama administration. And it's a network of organizations all over the American territory, and they took this video and organized discussions in community centers and in high schools to really create a national conversation around the stereotyping of black men as a source of problem, as opposed to a source of aspiration and possibilities, to really make people become much more aware of these stereotypes and how they can be challenged. And this organization had already decided to focus its work on the transformation of narratives. So this is characteristic of something much broader that was happening at the time in the philanthropic sector, led, for instance, by the Ford Foundation, one of the largest foundations in the US or internationally. And when I interviewed, what we know about the Ford Foundation is that when Darren Walker, who's a gay black man, became its president more than 10 years ago, he defined his agenda as the fight against inequality. And whereas often in the past, leaders of large foundations were just giving a lot of money to economists to do experiments such as moving to opportunity, instead he decided to define the fight against inequality through 4 pillars, and one of them would be narrative change, which he defined as capturing hearts and minds. So they used the resources of the Ford Foundation to do things like fund another organization called Just Films, which was behind the creation of the film Roma, which won an Oscar. And Roma tells the story of 2 indigenous women who work as domestic workers for a middle-class family in Mexico City. And as you watch the movie, the middle-class family is always blurred in the background, and the camera is just focused on the faces of these 2 women. And it humanizes them by we've witnessed them going through basic existential questions. So one of them needs an abortion. So you really see this person in a 3-dimensional way as a full human being, as she's struggling with, basic ethical issues and existential issues. And this film, not only was it produced and did it win an Oscar, but it was also shown on Netflix, along with other films that became other series, a series called Maids, which was also about domestic workers. And it was really a very explicit and conscious attempt to destigmatize domestic workers. And the film was conducted in conjunction with another person I interviewed named Agent Pooh, who is the leader of the National Alliance for Domestic Workers, also funded by Ford. So you have the creation of what in the book I called recognition chains, that is collaboration between people who are working toward broad, diffusing messages of inclusion that combines the work of cultural producers, like the movie director of Maid and Roma, together with funders whose role it is to legitimate messages and to scale them up to the point, and to really systematically attack groups, stigmatization of specific groups. So as this is happening, you have Lady Gaga, who becomes a well-known proponent of, let's tackle mental health crisis. And you have Lizzo, who attacks, whose cause is body acceptance. So this is something that becomes broader and broader, and I think very powerful and very much oriented toward the outcome is to celebrate and make more visible the need for inclusion in our society, which goes hand in hand with facilitating people living their life with more authenticity. So instead of being a closeted queer person, the kind of cultural production that I'm describing produces recognition and enables people to not live their life in the closet if they are depressive or if they have mental health crisis, for instance. So this part of the talk so far is really about the multiplication of plurality of definition of self. It's happening in corporations, as many corporations are putting in place family policies that define workers not only as producers, but also as caregivers by allowing, for instance, workers to leave early to bring their kids to the doctor or to bring their mother to the doctor. So this kind of orientation in family policies has been shown. There are studies that demonstrate that the workers end up being far more loyal to their employers and also have less absenteeism. So it generates, the goal is not only to promote diversity in the workplace by increasing the number of people of color, but in general to create a workplace that is more providing recognition to everyone in the multiplicity of roles that they have in their lives, which is correlated with better subjective well-being among workers. So I mentioned earlier another approach to weakening group boundaries, which has to do with, how are stigma reduced. So in one paper with two graduate students, we compared groups that are stigmatized, which have experienced different degrees of destigmatization over the last decades. And this one paper mentioned on the slide compares people with HIV/AIDS with people who are obese. So we read the secondary literature to really retrace how the two groups, particularly HIV/AIDS and obesity, experienced different degree of destigmatization over the last decades. And we came up with this kind of pathway. So what we show is that in both cases, you have series of actors. The actors typically are social movements, as well as knowledge workers, social scientists, legal expert, medical expert, journalists that are actively involved in transforming the meaning of the groups that we're concerned with, and as well as public figures. So in the case of HIV/AIDS, when the HIV/AIDS crisis started, I had just arrived at Stanford as a postdoc in '83. Everyone was really scared of HIV/AIDS, and it was also construed as a disease that was deeply stigmatizing because the people who had it were immoral. There was this notion that a lot of gay men had it because they were having sex with random people in public bathrooms. And that's the counter story told by medical experts over the following decades was, no, that's actually a disease that is not, particularly for gay people, anyone can get it. And they explain how it was diffused. And then you had people like Magic Johnson who came out publicly and said, I have AIDS, And then you had Lady Di who came to the US and removed her gloves and started shaking, without her gloves, the hands of people with HIV/AIDS, with journalists covering that very broadly. So in little by little, it came to be viewed as a disease like any other. Parallel process did not happen for people with obesity. Here we draw on the book of Abigail Sagi, a UCLA professor who wrote a book titled What's Wrong with Fat? And she shows the ways in which the American Medical Association systematically resisted the dissociation between obesity and moral stigma. Typically, people who are obese are viewed as lazy, not having high self-esteem, spending too much time on their couch eating, French fries or potato chips. And this vision of the obese as change very, very slowly, despite the fact that you have organizations like Dove, the soap, that had campaign advertising with women, large women, or Lizzo with the Grammys in 2020 performed surrounded by ballet dancers who were very large African-American women. The goal was really to engage in body affirmation. This has happened, but nevertheless, despite all these interventions, people who are obese remain deeply stigmatized. But the point of this figure here is that reducing stigma is a social accomplishment. It has happened. We know how it can happen, which means that it can happen more. And the last chapters of the book, the last chapter is very much about empowering, the reader in this period, this challenging period where so many people feel like there's no exit, that things are changing and that things can change more, with examples such as same-sex marriage as an example of the transformation of boundaries, even if, as for any other social movements, you have periods of reaction and counter-reaction. And I'm coming to the end of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about the Gen Zs, then conclude. So I didn't do these interviews myself because I'm a boomer, and boomers, Gen Zs absolutely do not want to talk to boomers. They're extremely upset at us. They think we're really screwed up, mostly because of climate change. And you've heard the expression, okay, boomers, i.e., move over, boomers, it's our turn. We're now in charge. We're in the cockpit. We're going to take care of social change. And when we interviewed these people, the main people they said were very inspiring to them. Greta Thunberg was the most often mentioned person, you'll be pleased to know. So the questions of our interviews were really, how do you see the problems of today? What kind of society would you like to live in? And what we discovered is that they were really braiding together different perspectives, which, in relation to the neoliberal scripts of self, they were extremely critical of this. They do not want to organize their lives around upward mobility and the white picket fence and the consumerism that they believe has captured the imagination of the boomers, of their parents. This is not what they want. They're not with the program. And that is, half of our sample was privileged, i.e. middle-class kids. The other one was less privileged, and also half of it was people of color. So what they're doing is they believe that it's important to be agentic and to take charge of their life, and to some extent to be entrepreneurial. They're American kids, right? They think you have to hustle a little bit. So they're not rejecting work. They embrace all this, although they don't believe they're necessarily going to be upwardly mobile. But they also say, because of climate change, we don't know how long we're going to live. It could be over in 20 years. It could be over in 100 years. They could live. So at the same time, they say life could be short, life could be long, but they're extremely concerned with quality of life. So, and they have been raised in the context of a very prominent therapeutic culture. So they talk about mental health all the time, and they talk about work-life balance all the time, and they think the boomers generation, my generation, we're crazy. We work too hard. We drive ourselves crazy, and they talk about the hedonistic treadmill of, wanting to move from one success and one accomplishment to the other and never having enough, or having the same experience through consumption. You buy something one day, you buy something else the other day. They think all of this is meaningless. So they're much more oriented toward leading today the life that they want to lead, and that includes having more egalitarian relationship with people. So in the context where I live, for instance, students are very upset when you describe someone by saying, he's an Asian American. No, you cannot describe people to their ascribed characteristics. It's simply not acceptable. They are human beings above all. And I think that a lot of the woke culture is tied to this. Their decision to embrace a non-binary gender identity becomes extremely important to them, and they're very impatient toward those who do not accept the use of non-binary pronoun, because I think just as they drop the American dream as a source of hope, they embrace a desire for inclusion with as much passion as their parents may want them to lead the American dream. So these become really points of tension across generation that may be hard to understand for boomers. And it's tied to their idea, demographers are right when they tell us we should not use labels such as Gen Zs or millennials, because those are invented by marketing experts. But in this case, I use it because they very much define themselves as Gen Zs. It's very much part of their identity and their political identity as people who want to change the world. Now, we did these interviews in 2020. Now we have two old men, probably in the context of the American election, pitted against each other, Biden and Trump. And I was just looking yesterday at new polls conducted in November about where fewer of them now are thinking of voting. It's clear that from a peak of politicization in 2020, they are now disengaging, and I think they're going to continue to disengage as long as those men are confronting each other. And you add to this, you know, Gaza and everything else, I think. So we will see what this generation will do. But what is clear from this slide is that they don't want what the boomers want, and they're in the process of inventing another way to live. And I think it's really important for the reader to understand why this is so important to them, especially against the background of the mental health crisis that I talked about earlier. So to conclude, the book really discusses a number of ways through which we can weaken group boundaries and also broaden inclusion at the same time. And this is happening as we lead our everyday life, and it's happening at many levels simultaneously. I can expand a little bit more on some of the aspects that I didn't talk much about ordinary universalism, but I'll just mention briefly. I have a paper on this that came out of interviews I conducted for The Dignity of Working Man with North African immigrants living in France in the early 1990s, and I would ask them, in what ways are the French, and this is more, you know, racism between toward North African immigrants in France is extremely high. What do you have in common with French people? And they would say, well, you know, we all need to get up in the morning to buy our bread. We all have 10 fingers. We all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We're all equally insignificant in the eyes of God. We're all children of God. So these are all like snippets of interviews that point to things that are basically shared by all human beings. And it's a form of universalism that is not about the Enlightenment, or as I said earlier, human rights. It's just about our shared experience. And this is something, the Gen Zs would say things really, really similar. Treat people with respect. And the working class people, even if I interviewed for that book, even if they were racist, would say, treat people like people. You know, basic human decency at the end of the day. I think that's what it's about. And these strategies for weakening group boundaries can be conducted at the level of interdisciplinary, interpersonal relationship, at the level of neighborhoods. So class segregation is extremely high in the US and has been growing rapidly as the upper middle class engages in opportunity hoarding, doing all they can to pass on all advantages possible to their children, which results in upper middle class people constantly trying to go and send their kids to the most exclusive and the better endowed school. But it also sends to their kids the message, you better be with the program. In order to be loved and be a good person, you better go to college and succeed and make a good living. And that, I think, feeds the mental health crisis, because it also tells the kids, if you don't do all this, you're not worthy. And a lot of kids feel that they don't matter because they are not going to be loved if they do not follow the program. So this is really about how pernicious the focus on achievement can be. And that's also feed class segregation, with the result that a growing proportion of Americans never have any contact with people of other classes. We have data that I mentioned in the first chapter of the book showing that, you know, the extent to which people of different class marry one another, go to the same school, the networks have become extremely segregated by class and by race. So this is something that the upper middle class really needs to act upon, and I think the Democratic Party has a lot of work to do to really understand better what most workers are against in their daily life. And there's a huge cultural disconnect at that level. So the importance of policymakers in intervening on these dimensions is really, really urgent. And then there's this broadening of group boundaries that happen at the level of everyday life that is manifested in signs such as this one that was on many launched during the Trump presidency after he made the executive order banning travel to a number of Muslim countries. So, and many international agencies are also contributing to these kinds of transformation. I just want to mention this Human Development report from the UN. I was the chair of this advisory committee for this report, and it's all about the importance of narratives in transforming the challenges and meeting the challenges that are ahead of us. So I think there's a lot of change that are happening at many levels at once, and this lens of looking at the production of new narratives of hope can maybe help us make sense of the changes as they are happening, while at the same time going beyond the controversies around wokeness, which we're going to talk about later this afternoon. So I'm going to stop here, but before I want to acknowledge and recognize the role of the research assistants who were participating in the project. And I want to say that the takeaway is also that transforming group boundaries is not only about being empathic and nice. A lot of the positive psychology literature emphasizes this. Do not mistake me for promoting that kind of message. I think, of course, it's nice to be nice, but it's really not enough. And the takeaway is we need to create an environment that is differently structured in promoting and diffusing messages about plurality of criteria of worth, for instance. Since that's where social scientists hopefully can have an impact on what's happening. So I'm going to stop here. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for an excellent and inspirational lecture.